Wyoming Territory, 1874, and the wind tore across the open plains like a living thing, rattling the windows of the small clapboard church where Tessa Johnson stood alone at the altar, her hands trembling around a wilting bouquet. The last of the men had left 20 minutes ago. She had heard their boots thudding down the steps, the muttered excuses, the low laughter that cut sharper than any blade. Plain, mousy, too old at 24. She was not what they wanted. Reverend Carter cleared his throat gently and said, "Maybe another time, Tessa." She forced a smile that barely held. Maybe. Outside, the sky was the color of old tin, and a dust storm was building in the distance. Carefully, she laid the rejected flowers down on a pew and walked out into the wind. The town of Eden Hollow was a small, rough place. Half-built storefronts, a leaning water tower, and a main street that turned into a river of mud every time it rained. Tessa had come here 2 years ago after her parents died of fever, hoping to start fresh. She had worked as a seamstress, taught reading to the children, even helped deliver 2 babies. But when it came to marriage, none of the men looked at her twice. Not until today. And even then, it had ended the same way. She pulled her shawl tighter and hurried toward the boarding house, head bowed against the wind. She did not see the rider coming until the hooves clattered to a stop a few feet from her. He was a stranger, tall in the saddle, his black duster trailing behind him like a shadow. His face was roughened by sun and time, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His hat was pulled low, but she caught the glint of his eyes, sharp and watchful. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and rough with dust and weariness. She nodded, heart hammering. "Sir." He swung down from the horse with a slow, deliberate grace. His coat shifted and she caught the flash of a gun belt, worn but well kept. "I am looking for a place to stay," he said. "Name is Vaughn Grayson." "Tessa Johnson," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Boarding house is just up the street. Mrs. Lacey runs it." He looked toward the sagging 2-story building, then back at her. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat and led his horse forward. Tessa watched him go, something stirring in her chest that she had not felt in a long time. A kind of wondering. Inside the boarding house, Vaughn secured a tiny room at the end of the hall. Tessa heard Mrs. Lacey grumble about dusty drifters but take his coin all the same. She went back to her own little room, trying to sew by lamplight, but her hands kept trembling. She finally gave up and stared at the window where the storm rattled against the glass. She did not know why the sight of that weary gunslinger unsettled her so. Maybe because he had looked at her, really looked like she was not just another face in the crowd. 3 days passed. The town buzzed with curiosity about the stranger. Some said he was running from something. Some said he had fought in the war and never been the same. Tessa kept her head down and her hands busy, but she could not help noticing how often Vaughn Grayson crossed her path. At the bakery, he held the door for her. At the well, he helped her draw up a heavy bucket without a word. And once, when a group of boys jeered at her in the street plain as dirt, Vaughn stepped between her and the noise, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his gun. The boys scattered without a fight. That night, Tessa sat on the porch steps, mending a ripped sleeve by lantern light. She did not hear Vaughn approach until he said quietly, "Mind if I sit?" She shook her head, throat tight. He lowered himself onto the steps, his boots dusty, his shoulders heavy. For a long time they just sat there, listening to the cicadas hum in the grass. "You sew for work?" he asked finally. She nodded. "And teach the little ones to read when I can." He was silent a moment. "Good work. Needed work." She looked over at him in surprise. No one had said that before. Not like it mattered. He caught the look and said, "Folks here do not see what matters. They got eyes, but they do not use them right." Tessa swallowed hard. "You do not have to be kind." "I am not kind," he said, and there was a rough honesty in it that made her chest ache. Just telling the truth. The storm broke that night, rain hammering the roof and turning the streets to rivers. Tessa huddled in her room, listening to the thunder. Sometime around midnight, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Lacey, pale and shaking. "Tessa, the water is rising. Vaughn says we need to move upstairs." Tessa grabbed her shawl and followed Mrs. Lacey down the hall. Vaughn was already hoisting 2 children from the first floor, one under each arm, mud dripping from his coat. His face was grim, determined. He caught sight of Tessa and said, "Come on." She did not hesitate. She trusted him even though she barely knew him. Upstairs, they crowded into the attic, the storm howling around them. Vaughn settled the children Peter and Polly. She learned their names, wrapping them in blankets. When he finally slid down the wall to sit beside her, he looked so tired she could barely stand it. "You fought in the war?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Virginia. Lost more than I can count." She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his hand. His skin was rough, scarred. But he did not pull away. "Me too," she said. "Lost my whole family to fever." He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, something wordless and deep. In the dark, with the storm raging outside, Tessa realized she was no longer alone. And neither was he. The morning after the flood, Eden Hollow woke heavy and sodden, the streets churned into deep brown mire. Tessa waded through it with her skirts bundled high, a basket swinging from her arm, heading toward the small schoolhouse where some of the children had taken shelter. Vaughn walked beside her, leading a mule he had bartered for to carry supplies. They moved in a steady silence until Vaughn shifted the weight of the basket from her to the mule without asking. She glanced up, but he was looking ahead, jaw set against the cold wind. "You always take care of folks you barely know?" she asked. He adjusted the mule's lead rope. "Didn't used to. Got tired of seeing what happens when no one does." Tessa tightened her grip around her shawl. "You must have seen a lot of that." He didn't answer right away. Only when they reached the broken fence outside the schoolhouse did he say, "Enough to last 3 lifetimes." Inside, the air was damp and smelled of wet wood. Mrs. Creeley, the town's aging schoolmistress, greeted them with weary eyes. Tessa set about handing out bread and apples, checking the children's bruised knees and muddied faces, while Vaughn repaired a cracked window pane with strips of torn cloth and nails pried from broken desks. Hours passed, and when the sun began to sink low and red over the hills, Mrs. Creeley pulled Tessa aside. "That man's not just passing through," the old woman murmured, glancing toward Vaughn. "He's looking for something." Tessa folded a torn shawl over a sleeping child. "Maybe he's looking for peace." Mrs. Creeley's mouth pursed, but she said no more. Later, after the last child had been carried home through the muck, Tessa and Vaughn lingered in the schoolhouse doorway, watching the dimming sky. "You planning to stay?" she asked, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. "Depends," Vaughn said, his gaze tracing the horizon. "A man needs a reason." She hesitated, then said, "I reckon this town could use another good man." Vaughn's mouth lifted, not in mockery, but in something quieter, something rare. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture plain and sure. As they walked back toward town, the sharp scent of wood smoke filled the air. Men had started lighting fires to dry out sodden homes. They passed the blacksmith hammering out bent hinges by lantern light and the widow Ames scrubbing mud from her porch. Tessa's steps slowed when they reached the boarding house. The windows glowed soft with lamplight, a promise of warmth she suddenly dreaded returning to alone. "You eaten?" Vaughn asked, his voice low. She shook her head, hesitant. He nodded toward the small cookhouse behind the livery. "Come on. Cookie owes me for fixing his fence." Inside the cookhouse, the air was thick with the smell of stew and fresh bread. Cookie, a wiry old man with tobacco-stained fingers, grunted at them and waved a ladle toward the battered table. Tessa sat stiffly on the bench and used to the easy way Vaughn moved through the space, pouring coffee, ladling stew into dented tin bowls. When he set one in front of her, she caught the faint tremor in his hand before he tucked it behind his back. "You hurt?" she asked, frowning. "Old wound," he said. "Comes and goes." She studied him across the table, the way the firelight caught the silver in his hair at the temples, the deep lines bracketing his mouth. "Do you miss it?" she asked, surprising herself. "The road. The fighting." He met her gaze without flinching. "No. There's nothing out there but ghosts." She nodded, understanding more than she could say. They ate in silence after that, the kind that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. When they stepped back out into the night, the wind had stilled, leaving the town wrapped in a hush. Tessa pulled her shawl tighter against the chill, and Vaughn offered his arm, not as a courtesy, but as something steadier. She took it without speaking, and they walked back to the boarding house together, their steps slow and unhurried, as if neither quite wanted the night to end. At the door, she turned to him, heart thudding. "Good night, Vaughn," she said, voice soft. He touched his hat again, but this time, he held her gaze longer, something unspoken passing between them like a promise. "Good night, Tessa." She watched him walk away under the silvered sky, her heart both aching and full, knowing something had shifted between them, something too deep for words. The next morning broke clean and cold, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Tessa stood behind the boarding house, hanging damp linens on the line, her fingers raw from the chill. The world felt scrubbed new after the storm, though the streets still sloshed with mud and the buildings leaned a little more than they had before. Vaughn appeared around the corner, leading the mule with a sack of feed slung across its back. He paused at the sight of her, as if weighing something, then stepped closer. "Town council's meeting at the hall this afternoon," he said. "They're looking for hands to help rebuild." She pinned a sheet to the line and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I can mend clothes, maybe patch a few roofs. I'm no carpenter." "They'll need every kind of help," he said. "And someone to keep them from tearing each other apart over who gets what first." Tessa smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from knowing exactly how quick men could be to argue over planks and nails. She shook out another sheet, the fabric snapping in the breeze. "You planning to stay long enough to see it done?" she asked carefully. Vaughn shifted his weight, digging the heel of his boot into the soft ground. "Thinking on it." She met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Maybe think a little faster. They could use you." He gave a short nod, and for a moment, the silence between them felt solid, like something built rather than broken. That afternoon, the hall filled with the smell of damp wool and drying wood smoke. Men and women crowded onto benches, their faces drawn with worry. Tessa sat near the back, her mending basket forgotten at her feet. Vaughn stood against the wall, arms crossed, saying little. When one of the ranchers, a heavy-set man named Earl Watkins, began shouting about who deserved the first shipment of lumber, Vaughn stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "Storm didn't pick favorites," he said. "Neither should we." The room quieted, the truth of it settling over the crowd like dust. Tessa watched the way the others listened to him, how even the loudest among them grudgingly nodded. By the end of the meeting, a rough plan had been agreed upon. Tessa volunteered to run a ledger of supplies, who needed what, who had what to spare. As she wrote names in looping script, Vaughn caught her eye from across the room. There was something certain in his look, something that made her chest tighten. As the crowd broke apart, he approached her table, removing his hat. "You've got a way of making order out of a mess," he said. She dipped her pen in the inkwell without looking up. "Someone has to. Not many would." She blotted the page and set her pen aside. "Folks don't usually notice when I do." "I'm not most folks," Vaughn said. His words settled deep, like a stone dropped into a still pond. She stood, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "Walk me back," she asked, her voice light but hopeful. He offered his arm, and she took it without hesitation. They stepped out into a world still battered but beginning to stitch itself back together. As they walked, Tessa glanced up at him. "Where did you learn to lead men like that?" Vaughn kept his eyes on the road ahead. "After the war, I drifted. Took work where I could. Sometimes that meant keeping rough men from killing each other over a card game or a patch of land." She thought about that, about the kind of life that wore deep into a man's bones. "Was it lonely?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Most days I didn't feel it. Nights were harder." Tessa tightened her grip on his arm, a small, steady pressure. "You're not alone now," she said simply. At her words, something in his stance eased, as if the weight he carried had shifted just enough to breathe. They reached the boarding house, and Vaughn turned to her beneath the porch light, its glow throwing soft shadows across his face. "Tessa," he said, voice roughened with something more than weariness. "I ain't got much to offer. No land. No fine promises." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his coat sleeve. "I'm not looking for fine promises." His breath caught, just once. Then he reached for her hand, cradling it between his rough palms. "I want to build something steady," he said. "Something that lasts." Tessa's heart beat hard against her ribs, but her voice was sure. "So do I." Vaughn bent his head, slow and careful, and she rose onto her toes to meet him. Their kiss was quiet, their hands finding each other with a wonder neither had thought to feel again. When they pulled back, the world around them seemed to hold its breath as if granting them this small, sacred beginning. Together, they stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind them against the chill of the world. The days that followed carried a rhythm Eden Hollow hadn't known in a long time. Men hammered new beams into place. Women stitched torn goods and baked bread to feed the workers, and the children ran wild between piles of lumber, their laughter echoing between the battered buildings. Vaughn worked alongside the others, repairing what he could, but each evening he found his way back to the small patch of porch outside the boarding house where Tessa sat spinning thread or darning socks. He would hand her a cup of coffee or a handful of wildflowers he picked on his way back from town. They didn't speak much during those hours, but the silence between them was thick with meaning, a kind of peace neither had known they needed. One evening, as the sun bled low over the hills and the smell of sawdust still clung to the air, Vaughn settled beside her and said, "I'm thinking about buying a plot north of the creek." Tessa set her sewing aside carefully, smoothing the fabric flat. "You mean to stay for good, then?" He studied the horizon where the land stretched open and wild. "I reckon a man's got to plant his roots somewhere. Might be time." She tucked a loose thread behind her ear. "The soil's good up there. Black and rich. You could raise cattle easy enough." Vaughn nodded, slow. "Might need someone who knows how to keep books straight. Supplies. Letters." Tessa's fingers stilled over the cloth. "Sounds like you're building more than a house." He turned to her then, his face etched with something solemn and sure. "I'm not much for fancy words, Tessa. But I figure if a man's lucky enough to find something good in this world, he ought to hold onto it." She looked down at her hands, the calluses on her fingertips, the quiet strength she had built out of loneliness and hard work. When she lifted her gaze, it was steady. "I'm not afraid of hard things," she said. "Not anymore." Vaughn's hand found hers, rough and careful. No promises spoken, just the certainty of it, the building of something slow and lasting. The next morning, they walked the land together. The grass swayed golden around their boots, and the creek burbled low from the rains. Vaughn pointed out where the house could sit, how the corral might stretch behind it. Tessa crouched near the water's edge, scooping a handful of cool, clear water. "You'll have enough here to last through dry seasons." Vaughn kneeled beside her, his knee pressing into the damp earth. "You think you could be happy out here? Away from town?" She let the water run through her fingers, watching how it caught the morning light. "Happiness isn't about where you are. It's who you're with." Vaughn's breath caught, just faintly. He reached out, brushing a stray blade of grass from her sleeve. "I never thought I'd find a place that felt right," he said. "Never thought I'd find a person who could see me plain and true." Tessa smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I see you, Vaughn Grayson." Later, they stopped by the blacksmith's to ask about nails and tools. Mr. Burkhart, a gruff man whose hands were blackened with soot, looked Vaughn over and said, "You building a home or a fortress?" Vaughn answered without hesitation, "A home. A real one." The blacksmith nodded once, a rare smile tugging at his mouth. "Then you'll need good iron. I'll set you up." Tessa watched Vaughn discuss costs and tools, the easy way he spoke to men now, no longer half in shadow. It struck her he wasn't just staying for her. He was letting himself belong. That night, back at the boarding house, Tessa leaned against the porch post, watching the stars blink to life overhead. Vaughn stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "You scared?" he asked, voice low. She shook her head. Not when I'm with you. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple ring, a slim band of silver. No jewels, no engraving, just clean and strong like the man offering it. My mother gave this to my father before he left for the war, Vaughn said. He carried it with him every day until he made it back. Tessa's breath caught as he slipped it into her hand. I want you to have it, he said. If you'll have me. She closed her fingers around the ring, feeling the weight of it, the history, the hope. I will, she whispered. Vaughn leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers, and for the first time in a long, long while, the world felt whole. They stayed like that under the stars, wrapped in the quiet certainty that they had found, against all odds, exactly where they belonged. Spring unfurled across Eden Hollow in tender shades of green, the creek swelling with meltwater and the hillsides dusted with early wildflowers. The town, worn but mended, carried on with a steadier heart, the scars of the floods stitched into its story rather than erased. Tessa stood atop the rise north of the creek, her skirts lifting with the breeze, watching Vaughn hammer the last board into the frame of their house. It wasn't much yet, 4 walls, a roof pitched against the hard Wyoming winds, but it was theirs. The land stretched wide around them, open and forgiving. Vaughn wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and looked over at her. You thinking it's too small? Tessa shook her head, smiling as she walked toward him. I'm thinking it's just right. He tossed the hammer into the tool crate and met her halfway, his fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve. A quiet touch that said more than any words might. I ran into Reverend Carter this morning, Vaughn said, his voice easy. Said he's willing to marry us come Sunday. Tessa's heart lifted. That soon? You waiting for a grand parade? Vaughn teased, his mouth twitching into a rare, soft grin. She rested her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of him. I'm not waiting for anything anymore. The wedding was humble, held in the same clapboard church where not so long ago Tessa had stood with a bouquet that withered in her hands. This time, she wore a dress she had sewn herself from soft blue cotton, and her hair was braided with tiny wild blooms Vaughn had gathered before dawn. The pews were filled with townsfolk, faces weathered and open. Mrs. Lacey cried into her handkerchief, and even Earl Watkins, who had once barked over lumber, clapped Vaughn on the back with a gruff congratulations. As Reverend Carter spoke the words binding them together, Tessa met Vaughn's gaze and saw not the drifter who had once ridden into town with nothing but a battered coat and a tired horse, but the man who had chosen to stay, who had chosen her. When the vows were spoken and the ring slid onto her finger, a slim silver band that carried the memory of battles survived and promises made, Vaughn kissed her, slow and reverent, while the bell in the steeple tolled once, twice, 3 times against the clear sky. Afterward, there was a gathering outside the church. Tables were laid with pies and roasted meats, and children darted between the adults, their laughter bright as the sunlight. Vaughn and Tessa shared a plate between them, seated close enough that their shoulders touched. Cookie, the cookhouse keeper, shoved a wrapped parcel into Vaughn's hands with a gruff, for your pantry. You'll need it. Vaughn passed the bundle to Tessa, who unwrapped it to find preserved peaches and a heavy jar of molasses. She laughed, touched by the rough affection behind the gesture. As the sun lowered, painting the sky in molten gold, Vaughn leaned close to her ear. Ready to go home, Mrs. Grayson? She turned to him, her heart full to brimming. I've been ready. They rode out together on a wagon loaned by the livery, their few belongings stacked behind them. The house waited on the hill, smoke curling from the chimney where Vaughn had started a fire earlier. The mule plodded steady beneath the weight, the wheels creaking in the hush of evening. At the house, Vaughn helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. Inside, the fire crackled low, the simple pine walls still smelling of fresh-cut wood. Tessa set a kettle over the flames while Vaughn carried in the last of the supplies. Later, they sat together before the hearth, the silence between them rich and easy. Tessa leaned her head against Vaughn's shoulder, the scent of smoke and fresh earth grounding her. He laced his fingers through hers, his voice low. We'll have a garden by summer. Maybe chickens, if we're lucky. She smiled against his sleeve. And in a year's time? He tipped his head, considering. Maybe a few more hands around here. A little one, if we're blessed. Tessa's heart swelled at the thought, the quiet, steady building of a family, of a life rooted deep in the soil they now called theirs. Outside, the wind stirred the grasses, whispering over the land that had seen war and flood and loneliness and still endured. Inside, Tessa and Vaughn sat wrapped in each other's warmth, the ring on her finger catching the firelight, a small, brilliant promise. Their life together would not be easy. There would be droughts, hard winters, long days of toil. But they would face it all side by side. Their love a quiet, unshakable thing built not on grand gestures, but on the hard, beautiful work of choosing each other every day. And in that little house north of the creek, under the endless Wyoming sky, Vaughn and Tessa Grayson found their forever.